Welcome to the second episode of Two Heads Are Better Than One, with me, Rod Grant.
And me, Cameron Wyllie. Thank you very much indeed to all our listeners for the first episode. We want to encourage you to subscribe if you like. We're not actually terribly sure between us how you do that, but some people have said they've subscribed and we think that's a good thing. And we also want to encourage you to share the podcasts so as many people as possible who might be interested in it can hear it.
And this time around, we're going to be focused on discipline, behaviour, and pastoral support in schools. What's going on? How good is it? How bad is it? Where are we? But first, some feedback from the first show.
So the first bit of feedback comes from Gavin, who is a teacher in Glasgow. I won't say more than that, Gav. And his interesting point was about this point about crap teachers that we made and how we actually identify crap teachers and what we do about them. Gavin is a young and successful teacher. He wants to know why he shouldn't be saying to people, why do I have to work so hard when Mr. Smith has vegetated in the staff room for the past 36 years and all his pupils fail?
You know, and in my own experience, Cameron, this is exactly what would happen in school. You know, you would have, say, a teaching staff of 40-odd teachers, and 35 would be giving absolutely everything to the job. And there were 4 or 5 that would be leaving right on the button at 4:30 or whenever it was, didn't really get involved in extracurricular clubs. And it's how to engage those teachers in doing more and doing better without feeling the teachers who are doing a really great job are somehow being denied their place.
I think that that's also, it's something to do with pay. It's something to do with the way that we pay teachers who are really, really good. And how do we keep these really, really good teachers in the classroom rather than them necessarily rising to the great elegance of management? And it's also a question of how we scrutinise and review teachers who we think are not performing well, because teaching's very collegiate, as we said the last time. And part of the problem is that people tend to defend teachers who are not performing well. And I just personally think it's just too important a thing for that to occur. It wouldn't occur with brain surgeons. You're not going to have a situation where you say, oh, old Jimmy's hand's getting a wee bit shaky, but nonetheless, you know, he was very good 30 years ago.
Yeah, but then, you know, I suppose taking a sewing club isn't a matter of life and death at the end of the day. So I would occasionally, as a head, come under pressure from other leaders within the school to say, look, you know, Mr. A is really not pulling his weight. I think we need to do something about it, or we need to change our rules about what we ask staff to do contractually. And I would always go against that. I'd always say, look, you know, you've got 40 teachers say, I'm really delighted with 37. Yes, I'll have little private conversations with those 3, but I'm not changing the ethos and culture of the school to become a more strict model where I am impelling teachers to do things that they may not necessarily want to do.
No, I agree with that. It's very, very much about encouraging people, and it's very, very much about praising people, and particularly praising young new members of staff who are doing lots and lots and lots. So the answer to your question, Gavin, is we don't really know what we would do about crap teachers because it's been a phenomenon that's been going on since the time of Dickens.
Having said that, Cameron, no? Before we started the actual podcast, we were discussing the fact that the new teachers coming into the profession really, in both of our experiences, are really committed, top class. They're teaching and learning second to none, actually. Have you found that over the period, suddenly we're finding more and more teachers that are really fully committed in a way that maybe they weren't 20 or 30 years ago?
Commitment is one thing. Their capacity to actually teach a good lesson is another. So you do get teachers who are very, very, very good in the classroom that don't do much else. I mean, that their commitment to the holistic life of a school isn't all that great. Yeah, so over the piece, I would say, if you look at the kind of people who were in schools when we started teaching, or indeed when we were pupils in schools, then I would say that over the piece, the teaching profession has improved hand over fist. one of the things that we'll get onto in a little while is how often these young teachers are now finding life very difficult in schools for reasons that are completely beyond their control and actually really lie in the hands of management and in educational policy nationally. But we'll get onto that in a wee minute.
And we received another email from Heather, and I think she was talking about the importance of extracurricular across the year groups.
I think she was. And Heather is a former parent of young people coming through our schools. And what she was really interested in was the idea of the vertical impact of extracurricular activities, by which I mean, if you say to most kids in most schools who are your friends, their friends will inevitably be in their year group. And they'll be in their year group because they go to classes with these people all the time. And Heather was making an interesting comment about the fact that looking at it as if people from fifth year, third year, and first year could all be pals, or at least could know each other and look out for each other a wee bit, is a product of extracurricular activities. So it's a product of all playing football together, or being in the pipe band together, or doing drama together, or whatever it is. And it reinforces, again, I think, which I very strongly believe, which is that extracurricular activities are very important and should be encouraged in all schools. And also a view that says that teachers should be paid to do extracurricular activities in all schools.
Yeah, and of course, the huge benefit of that vertical structure is that young children have older children as role models, not just adults. And the older children take a sense of responsibility for looking after the younger ones. I noticed this particularly because schools that we've worked in are 3 to 18. And we never had a rule of, right, you're not going to run in the corridor, for example. But you wouldn't get any 17 or 18-year-old running down the corridor because they knew they could turn the corner and come across a wee 4-year-old.
Yeah, try doing that in a 17th century building with winding turrets. Really, really weird. I remember at one stage, at Harriet's, the inspectors came in and asked to see our accident book because they were absolutely sure that these turrets shouldn't be allowed, really effectively. And in fact, we didn't have any problem with safety in these turrets because young people behaved so responsibly because they knew a lot of the kids in the school who were younger than them. And that anonymity makes the opposite, that the kind of anonymity makes things like bullying very, very much easier, and also turning a blind eye to bullying. I mean, some small child, well, if you know who that small child is, you're going to do better. And then we also heard from Dorothy, who is a retired teacher. And Dorothy was most interested in the stuff that we were talking about with regard to behaviour, which is a convenient link into what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah.
And so I asked Dorothy the question, when you worked in Portobello High School in the early 70s, which was your first teaching post. At that time, Portobello High School was, I believe, the largest secondary school in Britain. And I asked her, was she ever told to fuck off? And Dorothy's response was, not by anybody who went on to live. And then she said, actually, joking apart, absolutely never. So were you ever told to fuck off by anybody, Rod?
Strangely, no. I think I don't know whether it's respect or fear, or I would hate kids to be frightened of me, but there did seem to be a healthy respect. I think one of the things that I set out to do early on was to be the person that the child came to with any kind of reward. Whether it was a house mark or a bonus mark or whatever the system was, they had to bring it to me and explain why they'd been given it. And I'd shake their hand and I'd ask them about it, and I'd be the one patting them on the back. And they went out and, they were 6 foot tall. And then I was also the one that when things went wrong, they saw a different side. And I think what was important was that I felt as if I was liked, which I think is really important for all teachers to be liked. But also there was a healthy respect there.
Yeah, that's sacrilege, though, of course. You see, Rod's just said the like word, and that's really very, very bad indeed, because you're not really supposed to worry about being liked. I have to say,
I think it's crucial.
out there, so do I. Out there in the society, of course, as a lot of people know about me, is I absolutely demand to be liked. I have to be liked, and I find it very, very difficult indeed if I'm not. Now, but having said that, contrary to too, Rod. I've been told to fuck off by pupils at least twice, both in my fairly early years at Daniel Stewart's in Melville College. Once by a boy who I woke up in a class to which I was teaching history. I wasn't very good at teaching history. And
Is that why he had fallen asleep?
I'm sure that's why he fallen asleep. I think he was quite a wild boy. And I gently patted him on the shoulder and I said, Tommy, you need to waken up. And he said, oh, fuck off, Mr. Wyllie. And I wasn't really very sure what to do about that because it was said with such warmth and affection that I felt I couldn't really punish him. So I'm ashamed to admit I didn't. In another instance, dealing with an issue in the lunch hall, I was told to fuck off by a very angry boy who then told his housemaster to fuck off and therefore was taken to the headmaster. And the headmaster, more or less literally, kicked him out the school for a few days. And then he came back and apologised. And however, there is no doubt whatsoever that teachers are being sworn at on a daily basis in a lot of Scottish schools. Not every Scottish school and not every teacher. And really a very small minority of pupils, very probably. But nonetheless, it is happening and something needs to be done about it.
Yeah, and of course, this is not anecdotal. I'm reading here the EIS survey, which took place in 2023-4, which showed that from 2018 to 2023, there'd been a 53% increase, not just of poor behaviour, but of violence, nearly 100,000 cases. And of course, that increase primarily affects teachers, facing both verbal and physical aggression.
Yeah, and your figure of 100,000 there is probably actually only a fraction of what's really happening, because with regard to so many different aspects of it, there's a real resistance to record verbal abuse, physical abuse, violence, incidences of violence in the classroom, because it's not really defined very carefully what actually it is. But the real thing about this is, I think that for a great many people of our generation, by which I mean gentlemen over 35, and also the generations above us, you know, our grandparents and great-grandparents, those of them that survive, I think that it would be very, very, very unlikely that they could even take on board that behaviour was as bad in Scottish schools as it is in some Scottish schools these days.
I know, my father's case or my grandfather's case, the violence was perpetrated by the teachers, not the other way around.
Absolutely. Now, that brings, it's an interesting point, that, because there's an interesting point about balance. Were you ever belted when you were at school?
Oh, yes.
Oh, well, you see, tell us the story. Tell us one of the many stories then, Rod, about being belted at school.
So it was called the tawse, and it was a lovely little leather belt, thick, and I can still see it, tassels at the end, and every second tassel had been knotted.
Where was this about?
This was in a boarding school.
A boarding school.
I don't know why, but myself and 3 friends decided that it would be a good idea, as it was approaching bonfire night, to let off a fireworks outside our housemaster's study. Probably at around about the time that he would be going to sleep. So we'd sneak downstairs, we lit this long string of firecrackers with a lighter inside, and it was like World War II. It was phenomenal because it was in a stone corridor, in a stone hallway, and it reverberated and echoed around, and we didn't realise it was going to be quite so loud. We ran down the corridor, and unfortunately, a rather sneaky 18-year-old prefect caught sight of the miscreants and reported us.
A sneaky 18-year-old prefect being one of the good guys.
One of the good guys. He highlighted the miscreants, and I was one of them, and of course taken into his study and belted mercilessly 3 times in each hand. And then I made the fatal mistake of running to the washrooms and running my hands under cold water, thinking this would remove the pain, but all it did was create the ideal situation for cramp.
Meanwhile, I'm back in Miss Middleton's classroom when I'm 9. She didn't like me very much. I think it was probably because I talked a great deal. She had taught my brother, who was a distinct golden boy and who was about already 6'3" when he was 9. So he kind of stood out a bit, and I was just yappy, tiny little me, as I have more or less remained for the ensuing 59 years. But anyway, Miss Middleton, my pal John and I had done something good in mental arithmetic, and therefore we were allowed to take the milk crates back to the janitors, that being about as much of a reward as you could get in those days. Overexcitedly, I ran ahead of John, and John's grasp on the milk crate didn't happen, and the milk bottles all bounced off the concrete steps, these tiny wee bottles, and bounced out of the crate, and then descended 3 floors into the music department where they smashed. And I can actually remember the sound of bottles smashing. And Miss Middleton held an inquiry which lasted about 15 seconds, determined that it was my fault, and belted me. I was belted again. Well, I wasn't belted. That's the point. Somebody tried to belt me again. 3 years later, we were having a bean growing competition in class, and my bean was the second largest. We were doing it in groups, actually. Our bean was the second largest group, and we poisoned the tallest bean. Unfortunately, used Dettol, which had a quite distinct smell. And the boys whose plant this was drew this attention to the gentleman who was in charge of the class, and he was, understandably, very, very, very angry. He didn't ever use his belt. He got his belt out, he put a piece of chalk on a desk and said, "Is there any reason why I shouldn't do this to you?" Whammed what he thought was the piece of chalk. He missed the piece of chalk entirely and instead hit his own leg. And that was the end of that. And he was very, very angry, but the belting proceeded no further. Nobody here on this sunny day is saying that we think belting's a good idea.
No, absolutely not.
No, I mean, the point is the balance, really. So we've got rid of corporal punishment. We're not suggesting that corporal punishment is anything that should be brought back in a million years. But what are the sanctions that we should have in the schools to control behaviour is the question.
And of course, the government have gone down this restorative practice route where, we chat to the children who are misbehaving and swearing and spitting at us and throwing desks out of windows and goodness knows what else, in order to show them the error of their ways and appeal to their better nature to be kinder and more caring, and it's not working.
Well, I think the answer is, the bottom line is, and you suggested this yourself a wee while ago, pastoral care and discipline are two sides of the same coin. If you're the guy to whom young people come when they've done something good and you're congratulating them, or you're even drawing attention to the fact that they've done something good and praising them and making them feel good, you should also be the person who has the capacity to make them feel guilty or ashamed of what they've done, particularly if that's been some kind of act of physical violence or unpleasantness or bullying towards another young person or towards a colleague. And I personally think that if teachers can't do that, then they are failing in their duty. I should say they won't do that, then they're failing in their duty, because there's certainly plenty of teachers who would like to see much firmer rules and regulations in schools, but who are prevented from establishing those rules and regulations because of educational policy out there. Interestingly, you said that it was the government that was in favour of restorative conversation. Well, the Scottish government would deny that. They'd say that has nothing to do with us. It's up to local education authorities and the council to determine precisely how you go about discipline in schools. But let's just talk a wee bit about what we think should happen. So what should happen to a child, let's say a 15-year-old boy who tells his French teacher to fuck off? Not even in French, Rod.
Well, that's shocking in itself. These are questions that are coming at me from friends and colleagues that are still are working in schools today, and this is a daily occurrence. So that if it's a daily occurrence, it means that whatever any teacher is doing about children that are saying fuck off, it ain't working. And I think we've gone down the route of determining that children need not punishment, but this kind of coaching towards being better. But as I said earlier, for me, that's not working, and colleagues who are working in schools today are telling me that it's not working. What's the answer? Well, there seems to be this real need not to suspend or, heaven forbid, expel pupils from schools. There's no specialist provision for children who cannot modify their behaviour. And the real issue is that children themselves now know that there are very few consequences for their poor behaviour. And so this is a kind of a vicious cycle where, they're sent to a room for a couple of hours and they're monitored by a member of the management team, and then they're sent back to class. I mean, I had one horrific story about a boy who had been spat at, urinated on, that a group of 4 or 5 youths had actually tried to set him on fire. And the leadership of that school, the only thing they could come up with was allowing that boy to leave 10 minutes early at the end of the school day.
Yeah, that's just sickening, really. I mean, that kind of thing is just awful. And the problem is that in that kind of instance, there should be absolutely clear sanctions for exclusion. I mean, in that instance, I can't really see how these kids who did that to that child could conceivably even return to that school. I mean, they should really be going off somewhere else. Now, the other problem is, according to their age to some extent, that we have a duty as teachers and as adults to present the world as it is to the young people who are in our care. This is, I mean, it used to be a great truism of teacher training that we were to see schools as being microcosms of society. So you had your own little community and what went on in it. Now, we have to allow for the fact that young people are young people, bless the beasts and the children. But at the same time, we've got to get them ready for the outside world. And my difficulty partly lies in the lack of stricture for people doing things wrong, but it also lies in what happens to the child who's doing these things wrong for whatever reason. I mean, I understand that young people can get really upset because they have come from a difficult and disadvantaged background, because very bad things have happened to them, or because they are neurodivergent in some way and find the stresses of mainstream education very, very difficult to deal with. But all that said, that will not protect them in the outside world at a later stage in their life. And what concerns me really is that the child who attacks a school teacher because they're fed up with them and pushes them over might try to do the same thing in a bar one day when they're 19 and might end up getting a knife in their throat. And that really concerns me. I mean, I'm not just piously saying that. If we do not ensure that young people understand that there are consequences for their behavior, we are failing them, and we're failing them in the future as well, in their future lives. And it's a bit of a crisis in Scottish education. I mean, you said, somebody tells a teacher to fuck off and they're put into seclusion for a couple of hours and that's all that happens. Most of the time, nothing happens, or not simply nothing happens. I wrote in the paper not long ago about a young PE teacher who I knew, and that young PE teacher gave up his job eventually, and he said that what had happened was he had become completely inured to young people telling him to fuck off at the school in which he taught in East Lothian.
Yep. And I think you mentioned mainstream. I think the presumption of mainstream is an issue. Now, you asked me, what's the solution? Well, first of all, bad actions deserve consequence. And if you're actually finding that kids are being violent and kicking or punching or spitting, or that's really serious. You just talked about, I mean, the whole purpose of education is that we're preparing them for the real world. Well, that's not preparation for the real world.
Yeah.
And just exactly as you said in your example. But there's also this presumption that all young children are legally entitled to an education. However, I think I do have a solution, because if COVID taught us anything, it was an ability, not a very good ability, but there was an ability to continue a child's education remotely.
Yeah.
So wait a minute, let me finish. So I might be suggesting that government or local authorities should be setting up online schools, an online school per region, and children who cannot modify their behaviour are not being expelled from education, but they're expelled from the building in which the violence is taking place.
Well, the bottom line is that there are three parties in these situations. So if an upset, angry child gets very angry with a teacher and abuses them, spits at them, pushes them, etc., that is a disruption of the lesson. So the three parties that are involved are that child, the teacher, and everybody else in the room. And increasingly, I think we have taken our eye off everybody else in the room. And I think that's one of the contributory factors to the decline in Scottish educational standards. And in this instance, I'm not talking about violence per se, I'm talking about academic standards. Children are learning less, and they're learning less because all this misbehaviour and all the repercussions of that are going on in a school when it need to be dealt with much more directly. I personally think that a plan which involves these young people going and learning offline won't work. And I think it won't work because it's going to require either a separate place for them to go to where they learn online, in which case they might as well be learning from a teacher, or they're going to be doing it at home and they just won't do it at home. There's plenty of evidence from COVID which said that a lot of kids, COVID stretched the poverty-related attainment gap indisputably.
Yep.
And part of the reason for that was an overassumption on the part of the SNP government that young people would just get up in the morning and blankly switch on their computers to carry on with the worksheet that Miss Smith had set them in geography. Well, they just didn't do it.
Yeah,
And those who are most disadvantaged did at least.
Yeah, but my point is you're not denying them an education.
Well, you're not denying them an education, but my personal preference would be just simply to say this. We understand that young people who kick off in classrooms and are children that we might describe as having disturbed behaviours, children who actually just really can't cope with mainstream education a lot of the time. We understand that in the main, that is not their fault directly. A lot of them are not making these choices. That doesn't matter, however, on one level, because on one level, they need to be disciplined for that. And then you've got to determine what happens with regard to their education. Actually, I think the presumption of mainstreaming as a policy has simply failed. And I think it's been a disaster for Scottish education. And I think most heads and deputy heads of Scottish schools would agree that the number of children who cause them real problems on a daily basis is extremely small.
Yeah.
I spoke to the deputy head of a comprehensive school in Edinburgh, and he suggested to me, when I asked him that question, he's got about 1,000 pupils, how many of them, and he reckoned that if you took away 10 of those pupils, then that would have the effect of reducing the pastoral load, the disciplinary load, by about 50%, so that the staff could actually concentrate a bit more on the nice lassie at the back of the room to whom they barely ever talk because she doesn't do anything wrong. So we've got to get back to being able to encourage our staff to talk positively to good kids, to encourage them to find out more about them, rather than how to concentrate all the time on the ones who are causing the most trouble. Because I personally think that those kids should be either part of the time or all of the time in different institutions altogether, or in units within schools where they are being looked after by highly trained, highly specialized, well-paid teachers. We're not writing these kids off. What we want to do is make their educational journey a great deal more successful it is in the moment. Because if you're shoving your teacher all over and swearing at her, at the end of the day, you're not learning anything.
No, and we have to advocate for the 90% of kids that want to learn and are having their education impacted upon.
I think 90% is actually quite modest. I think it's actually probably more than...
It probably is, yeah.
But one of the problems that happens, and again, I have a couple of deputy heads who talk to me about this. I think one of the things that happens is that if you're in your classroom trying to do your maths with the maths teacher, and outside the door there are kids running around that create a lot of noise and and not going to classes, and there's nothing that can be done about that, it's quite hard for a 13 or 14-year-old to say, actually, I think I might prefer to be outside the door running around and having a laugh rather than doing my maths. So that's the problem. Your tiny percentage of kids, that tiny percent of their kids grows because there isn't a sanction put in place for those who are there. And let me just say, if there are heads and deputy heads and teachers out there who disagree with any or all of this, you should contact us by email and we will, engage with that, because I think it's really important that our perspective as older gentlemen who are not necessarily in a classroom anymore, that our perspective, if you think our perspective is completely wrong and the current situation is just dandy, please feel free to say that as well.
Yeah, and on the other hand, we want to hear about the experiences that teachers are going through.
The horror stories as well.
Tell us the horror stories.
We won't even tell people what your name is.
No.
We'll change your gender and we'll call you things like Annabelle, and when in fact you're a rugby coach, and we'll do that with pleasure. So just tell us. We'd like to know more about this because we think not enough is being said about it. Although in I think yesterday's Scotsman, an interesting anonymised account from a teacher in Glasgow, accounting for his week of violence in his classroom. It's shocking reading. I mean, it's just a shocking reading. How can people carry on teaching under these circumstances?
I know, I'm gobsmacked. Well, I have a colleague, a friend of the family, who is working in a school in West Lothian, where currently there are 11 members of staff off sick with stress.
Yeah, everything is moving very, very gently and incrementally towards the perfect storm, whereby schools will not be able to open because they have moved into a situation where there are so many staff off with stress that they can't get substitute teachers. Teachers aren't joining the profession because they see how difficult it is. It doesn't matter how brilliantly able you are as a teacher. You can't teach if there is lawlessness in your classroom. So the essential thing really is to move towards calm, safe classrooms where every child wants to go to school because they are productively learning and they are not afraid.
Yeah, there has to be a safe environment to learn.
Absolutely.
There's nothing worse than fear to impact your learning ability.
That's just the teachers.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, we want to establish that first, and everything else can follow on from that. But educational reform in Scotland has to start with doing something about safety for staff and pupils in the classroom, in the corridors, and in the schools in general. And that requires serious sanctions to be reintroduced, because all this experimentation with these kind of with restorative conversations and with no blame bullying and these kind of things, they've all just failed. And they are creating a generation of young Scots, not an entire generation of young Scots. There are plenty of highly productive young Scots who do perfectly well, but there's a lot of young people who are afraid to go to school.
And this comes back to the point made earlier, that phrase, one size fits all.
Yes.
And, you look at the world, one size never fits all.
No.
It has to be nuanced. It has to have specialist provision. And that's the big issue in Scotland for me. There is no nuanced provision anymore.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, the whole thing has been a bit of a cynical act to save money, the truth be told. The removal of special education in Scotland, the rumming down of special education in Scotland, and the presumption of mainstreaming that accompanied it, which led to lots of kids going into mainstream education who can't really cope there, that was largely a financial exercise.
Yeah.
And that is absolutely shameful. So that's been a wee cheery discussion we've had today, Rod,
Indeed.
about the horror of certain moments in certain classrooms in Scotland at the moment.
That's it for this episode of Two Heads Are Better Than One. We hope you've enjoyed our journey through the world of schools, leadership and everything in between, in this case particularly relating to discipline, behaviour and pastoral support. And as we said throughout the podcast, if you've got your thoughts or questions or stories of your own, we'd love to hear them. And you can reach us on rodandcameron@gmail.com. And please make sure to follow, share and subscribe so you don't miss the next episode, where we will have a special guest focusing on what makes a great lesson. We're going to look at detail at that great word, pedagogy. But remember, In education and in life, two heads really are better than one. Thanks for listening. Class dismissed.